back up here, and then we'll start with this one. And the slide gets totally washed out. There are two lines, actually there are three lines on this graph, but you can't see more than one probably. Okay, so this is awful. You can see this one. This is the world food consumption from 1960 to present. And it's measured in the average daily calorie consumption per person. And so back in 1960, the global average calorie consumption, I'm not sure exactly how this is determined, but it's just some kind of statistical mean. And it looks to be, somewhere between, about 2,200 calories per day. And that's average across all regions in the world in 1960. Well, the good news is food access, or at least calorie access, has improved so that now the mean is a little over 2,800 calories per day. Now there's another line that indicates the least developed countries in the world, and I can't even see it. Wow, it just didn't show up at all. Let's see that. What happened? There was a line there and it just disappeared. Well, anyway, you can imagine the other one, the least developed countries, is like they're here. And then here's the United States. So this is your shame line. All right. So I always thought of it. Oh, okay. So we're doing really good. We're doing fantastic. But the average daily calorie consumption peaked. Kind of interesting. It peaked about 2004, something, 2005, right about here. And since then, it's gone down, and then it's kind of gone back up. But we started off at about 2850 back in 1960, and I would trust this line more than the world line. Calorie consumption has basically ratcheted its way up until about 15 years ago, and then it kind of fell, and now it's still gradually going up. Just kind of interesting. Basically what we want to get here is, number one, the most developed countries in the world have this sort of thing. Although I bet Americans can out-eat everybody as a group. But living a highly industrialized, post-industrial economy lifestyle allows enormous amounts of food availability, right? There are people out there who said it first, but it was a really good observation that you go to developing world and you don't see a lot of overweight people. And I'm speaking from the point of view of an overweight guy. All right. So you don't see a lot of people who are overweight in the poorest parts of the world. In the United States, it's the wealthiest people who are usually least overweight, and some of the poorest people are the most overweight. So there's an issue there, there's a problem there. We don't have any problem getting calories. We have problems. We have relatively less expensive food now, but the quality of food, the price of quality food has gone up. Right? So anyway, in our society, food prices have recently, in the last few years, last decade, have actually gone up. Our food prices in general, and a lot of that is because more people are consuming more expensive food. Right? I've started buying more organic stuff in the last few years, trying to watch the quality of stuff I buy and stuff I eat. But not everybody has access to high quality food. As I mentioned to you, I think the other day, I was driving through Oklahoma City and saw somebody walking from the new grocery store, like 2 miles from the new grocery store, food desert. All right, so that's one thing we can consider, but we want to get more to cropland and that sort of thing. So the next graph from chapter on agriculture is one that I'm very familiar with, although I've only seen it since this semester on this graph. But this is something that you should definitely know. Everybody should know this in the United States. The total number of farms in, let's say, 1850 steadily grew until, you can see, generally about the turn of the century, and then the Depression hit. Number of farms went up, and then since about World War II, we have been in this downward trend in terms of the number of farms until around the 1980s. Okay? In the 1980s, things kind of leveled off. And farm sizes, or the number of farms, are still sort of in decline, but there are all sorts of problems with that number of how many farms are there in the United States. Okay? At the same time, we've got another graph. This is the one that you should know in relative to this number. So the number of farms and the average size of a farm. Basically, I don't know why it went down, but the average size of the farm basically has gone up since about the Great Depression, or really the whole 20th century has gone up. Then it really takes a jump around World War II, a little before World War II, and after World War II, really takes off. This is the size of farms. And currently, the average size of the farms is still going up, but it's kind of settled off. It's kind of leveled off a little bit. All right. So there's a relationship, obviously. There are larger and larger farms and fewer farms, at least since the 20th century. Why would this happen? What would be the many reasons to explain these trends?
Because whereas why that's kind of shifting is one of the main reasons is labor is increasing in price, especially in the United States. So you have less people to run those farms, but also manufacturing equipment is getting better and better, so you have the ability to utilize less labor and more machinery to have less people manage more farmland. So there's less people that own farms, but bigger farmlands since they have bigger.
So the industrialization of agriculture with mechanized implements and basically tractors replacing horses.
Yes.
Right. Tractors replacing horses, and then the growth in the size of tractors and growth in the size of implements allows greater and greater production per farm, per farmer. And the larger and larger implements you have means it makes a lot more sense to have larger and larger fields, right? And so number one, have to remember, maybe you come from a farming family. I actually came from a farming family, and I used to drive a tractor in the summertime. That was my job. And I can tell you one thing that we learned from our farm experience, and that was, don't ever get into farming. You'll lose your mind. Okay? It's very, very, very difficult to make a good living farming. It's incredibly risky financially, and we used to have a joke, we're going to farm till the money runs out, and pretty much that happens. So the profit margins for most types of farming very, very tight. Now, if you can increase the scale of production, like anything else, if you're making T-shirts or whatever, if you can increase the scale of production, then you're going to enjoy what we've referred to as economies of scale, right? So it's the same sort of reason why Walmart killed off all the small retailers in every small town in the country. Because they can work in volume retail, and because it's ordering and moving in huge volumes, it doesn't have to make such a high profit margin on each item. So it is able to still be the world's largest retailer. Does Amazon count as the world's largest retailer now? Anyway, Walmart is the largest brick and mortar retailer now. I'm just trying to use that analogy. So, a farmer who has 160 acres, which was okay for a farm in 1850, 160 acres can never compete with a farm that is, let's say, 500 acres, or certainly 1,600 acres. Another trend with regard to like average farm size, if you were talking about one type of crop like winter wheat, what we used to grow around here, winter wheat, basically the size of acreage required in order to have a profit that would make that farm viable with fuel, rent, equipment, and paying interest on loans and everything else. The farm size has gone steadily up. As farm size goes up and the efficiency increases, the price of the commodity generally falls, right? And so as the price of the commodity generally falls, the greater you have to scale up in order to still make profit. Unless governments keep prices artificially high or something like that. But that's the big game in agriculture is that you can always count on the need to expand either your productivity or your land. Most of the time, farmers can only expand their land. They can't really come up with innovations themselves to increase productivity. They might a little bit, but generally they don't. They know they want to borrow more money, get more, or lease more land. Most farms today are not landowners as much as they are land leasers. And anyway, we used to in the 1970s and 1980s there was a lot of hoopla about the American family farm disappearing. Well, a lot of people were very sympathetic to that. They had Farm Aid, they started Farm Aid and all that kind of stuff. And the only people that I knew that really weren't very sympathetic to all that were farmers, because they realized, it's a business, and you've got to be able to increase the scale of production if you're going to survive. When my grandparents on either side were farmers, and they, after World War II and mechanization, they were not able to compete on the farm. But there are a lot of other things they could do in town. So, like many people in this area, after World War II, there started to be more of a rural to urban migration. And both families of either side of my parents moved to town, as I said, in the 1950s. And my parents went to rural schoolhouses out in the country, but they went to high school here in Stillwater. So it was, it's just a general trend. And what did they do with the land that they owned, the little land that they owned? Well, they sold it to other farmers. Okay, so other farmers buy them out, or some people would continue to own the land and just lease it out. So the farmers who stayed out would expand their production scale. They would buy new and larger equipment, and they would be able to produce larger and larger quantities of grain. In the 1980s, when we farmed winter wheat, we had about 1,000 acres around Payne County. 1,000 acres in probably 12 to 15 different fields. And those fields were scattered, as much as like 15 miles away. So a lot of my job was always moving equipment, driving tractors down the highway and stuff like that. You don't see it so much anymore, really, because farms are more industrialized, they've relocated largely. Winter wheat hardly is grown at all in this area, in this county anymore. But it used to be. And most of the fields that I used to plow when I was a kid are now residential subdivisions, believe it or not. So it's, you just see, this is a change that's taking place. Okay, so water, we talked about mechanization. Now look at this graph. You see, after World War II is when, tractors, cheap gasoline-powered rubber-tired tractors started being manufactured by Ford Motor Company as early as, before the Great Depression in the late 20s. But they were still very expensive, so only the farms that were most specialized and very, very higher profit, generally mechanized. Around here in Oklahoma, hardly anybody had tractors before World War II. They may have had threshers, you just kind of have to have a thresher if you're farming wheat. But after World War II, even the sort of less profitable, even the marginal areas of production in the United States started getting cheap, Ford tractors, other brands, of course, and the scale of production, the average farm size, took off after World War II. And then by the 1960s, it really took off as farms really consolidated. And now, most of the farm production in the United States is what we would probably call industrial scale or corporate or, whatever. It doesn't really matter to label it. Basically, it's much larger scale, much larger fields, often concentrated in certain regions where the particular soils and climate are just right for and water availability is just right for a particular crop. Give you an example. And the number of people involved in farming, went from 1850 probably almost on the order of at least 85–90% of the total population involved directly living on farms. To, at this point, the number of people who are actually involved directly in farming as for employment, is less than 2%. And that's another difficult thing to kind of define, because how, if you own an equipment manufacturer, if you own an equipment retailer, or you even farming, or you're associated with farming. Anyway, so that's going way up. The proportion of people involved directly in agriculture is going to lay down. And that's just a sign of industrial economy, really. Now, number of farms. This is the problematic line for a couple of reasons. How do you define a farm? Well, there's an agricultural census, believe it or not. And the agricultural census, unlike the population census, is more frequent. It's every 5 years. And agricultural data and agricultural census relies on actually pretty specific stuff, because farmers have certain tax rules that non-farmers don't have to bother with. And so the IRS and the U.S. Department of Agriculture has all kinds of data on size of fields and number of acres on the farm, all kinds of stuff. So there's lots and lots of agricultural data out there. So it's not because this line is not problematic because of lack of data. That's what I want to make clear. this line is difficult to really understand because there are lots and lots of non-farm farms. All right? Does that make any sense? It does make sense. Why?
Maybe people don't want to be put under the farm tax scheme.
Exactly. So if you own a lot of agriculture, if you own a lot of rural land, most likely you're going to be, at least in this state, you're going to be calling it agricultural land. And that might mean that you need to file for an agricultural exemption, so that you have a farm tax card, farm tax number. Okay? And maybe you've noted that. Farm tax numbers are only available for those people who have land that is classified as agricultural land rather than like residential land. Agricultural land is taxed in Oklahoma at a tiny fraction as compared to non-agricultural land of whatever kind. So there are tax benefits to it. So there are a lot of land that is considered farms that really isn't in farms. And so that's one reason this tends to level off and not decline further. If you looked at the production, actual farms that are producing, then it may be different. All right. What's another control? What's another factor that would be involved with this besides mechanization? Well, industrial scale agriculture requires certain things that smaller scale agriculture doesn't. And another facet of this could also be that there are farms now that are operating on smaller scales because of the move toward organic agriculture. I mean, it's not to say there isn't large-scale organic agriculture. There's increasingly there are small-scale dairies, small-scale egg and poultry production, organic. And certainly lots of smaller scale fresh produce operations that don't want to be big. Okay? And they actually have a much higher value product, so they're able to make profit with less production. And if you read the chapter in your e-text, you'll probably sense from the writing that the author wants everybody to live an organic farming lifestyle, which is kind of a lot to say. I mean, it's not going to be possible if it weren't for industrial scale agriculture, we really might be in a crisis situation in terms of food production.
Dr. Bates, sorry, quick question, kind of off topic. I was reading through Biden's infrastructure plan that he's trying to get passed before the government shuts down and everything. And in the farm aid section, I didn't read through all of it, but he's basically trying to incentivize producing staple crops that we would use for like animal products. Do you think that's a good idea given our current economic model and current climate trends?
What's his justification?
He says it's just to kind of rehabilitate. I don't know what word you'd use, but rehabilitate the agricultural sector, since there is a discrepancy in the number of farms versus size of farms. I think he's just trying to
So staple crops.
Yeah,
I know what a staple crop. I know that definition.
Sorghum, corn.
So, grain crops.
Yeah.
Okay. Because a staple crop could also mean cotton. Usually, a staple production or staple crop is the primary cash crop of a region. Like around here, beef. Beef's not a plant, but it's a production. It's what our agriculture is focused on. Even if you're producing corn, irrigated corn out in Texas County, or you're producing soybeans here in Payne County, or sorghums out western Oklahoma. All that's going toward mostly the beef industry, maybe also the pork and poultry industry, but it's all meat oriented generally. I don't know why I'd be interested in seeing that. So maybe let me read it before I say anything about it. But it seems that seems a little, to me at least, like it would be oriented towards international trade or something like that. But I'd have to look at it before. And so the Biden infrastructure plan, how many pages is that?
I
Like
did
10,000?
not read the whole thing.
Okay,
It's,
all right.
It's a lot of
Well, let me know what that is, and I'll see if I can answer that question.
Okay.
Now, I would imagine, to me, I would guess that Biden would want to put more and more land into conservation reserve.
Mhm.
You know, conservation reserve is basically you're giving farmers an incentive not to farm, or at least to allow native plants to come back. And in recent years, conservation reserves kind of been neglected. You know, it used to be a big deal, but now it's kind of, and maybe carbon sequestration would be a good reason to continue conservation reserve or CRP programs.
Well, it just reminded me, and I think it was this class that you discussed, like a previous administration, like directly before the Dust Bowl, also did something kind of similar where they really pushed farming, and then the Dust Bowl happened.
Exactly. And a lot of people have written on this, and they blame World War I generally. And World War I, of course, in 1914, the United States, when Europe went to war, the United States immediately realized that we have a market here because they're not going to be able to farm. So we went, we took it upon ourselves to produce enough food to ship to the Allied forces. All right? And we already did that. But one thing that the federal government did at that time was they encouraged farmers to open up new lands for wheat production and for other types of crops, but around here, winter wheat. And not only did they support the price of winter wheat, they artificially kept it high, artificially, for a number of years. So you had a guaranteed profit if you could harvest it. But they also provided lots of provided a lot of cheap capital, a lot of cheap money, so that farmers could take out loans for tractors and so forth. So you could milk the federal government and put it into production. And for what that did initially was it produced what some people call the Great Plow-Up. Now the Great Plow-Up, if you look at it, actually was going on before World War I. In places like western counties of Oklahoma, the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles, those had been settled on not just the Homestead Act, but Homestead Act much later, Homestead Acts. There were also other programs that allowed people to claim land in arid regions. So the High Plains, today the High Plains that is all irrigated if it's agriculture at all, was put into dry land cultivation without irrigation. They didn't have irrigation out on the High Plains until the 40s, really, late 40s. But dry land irrigation was doing okay prior to 1931, okay? 1932, something like that. There were in the plains, historically we've gone through wet periods and dry periods. And the 1890s was a dry spell. When people settled this area in 1889, they started cutting in farms, and then a drought hit in 1893. And if you came from like the Cherokee Outlet, that opened up in 1893 during a drought, okay? And that drought lasted until 1896. Terrible, terrible drought. It forced a lot of people off the land. But after 1896, it got wet again, and we had a series of very good, plenty of rainfall years, plenty of precipitation until about 1930, and then went into a long drought. There was another drought, a worse drought than in the 1930s, in the 1950s. Okay, the 1950s was a much hotter drought, and it also affected production. So when those droughts would hit, that would put the marginal, the farmers who were just barely making it, it would put them right out of business, right? And then after the drought, those lands would be accessible to other farmers who might purchase them or might just lease them. So the expansion of agriculture, or expansion of farm size, often comes, it's not steady. It's not a steady, it's like there are opportunities, for, so we were talking about drought, right? And the Great Plow Up. So the Great Plow Up allowed pre-mechanization agriculture opened up a lot of land, but then with cheap money in the 1930s, well, in the 19-teens, during World War I, what happened was we had great production, and there were lots and lots of profits being made. A lot of barns were built until about 1920. In the 19-teens, from like 1910 to 1920, there's a ton of barns that were built all over the state. But after 1920, after the war was over, then the Europeans started producing their own food. And the federal price controls were dropped. And what happened was every major staple crop, cotton, wheat, corn, they weren't growing soybeans yet, the prices took a plunge. And that's why farmers, it's often said that the Great Depression began about 1932, 31, 32. The agricultural depression began about 1921 or 22. And it never got better until World War II. The reason there was a depression was because commodity prices were falling every time. And agricultural commodity prices would keep falling because every year farmers would expand their production, okay, and there were gluts and gluts. And so when the Great Depression arrived, that helped a little bit. The federal government had the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It was the law that every farmer hated because it was the Agricultural Adjustment Act and other great New Deal programs that attempted to save American agriculture by wasting food. So people are like starving, in cities, or in soup lines because they can't afford food. But in farm country, the federal government was going around shooting cattle and paying, like $1 a head to kill and exterminate livestock because they couldn't sell them. I mean, there's no, the price wasn't there, and paying farmers not to farm. So it was a terrible time. There was gluts, and anyway, since World War II, really since the Great Depression, the USDA has become a major player in every facet of farming there is in the United States. So now, farming, believe it or not, is one of the most regulated things there is in the U.S. And it's very much dependent on programs that are federal programs. In fact, Oklahoma A&M College, Oklahoma State, is very much at the middle of that nexus between the federal government and farmers. That's why we have an office in every county of the state, right? Because we have an extension program, and it's all about federal programs and federal research dollars for agriculture. All right. Well, I don't intend tend to soliloquy like that all the time, but it was a good question. But I'll try to look into that if you can get the citation to me. I'll try to read something that's in the Biden administration. Okay, as long as it's not Green New Deal stuff. All right. You might say, well, that's kind of odd. If you're teaching conservation, would you be for the Green New Deal? The answer for me is no. Okay, so anyway, this line is beef. This line is sheep and goats. We actually used to have some sheep in Oklahoma. It was mostly up in Kay County. I used to show sheep when I was a kid, but nobody was ever interested in sheep. And I was never interested in sheep. I always wanted to show cattle or hogs. Hogs were the coolest thing to ever show if you're in 4-H or FFA. You just whack them and didn't have to. Anyway, never mind. Poultry production. Look at poultry production. It's gone way up throughout the last half century, or 60 years actually. And beef, how would you say beef production has changed? It went up during the 1970s, but it's pretty much stayed the same. And since about the 1990s, it's kind of declined. Why is that? This is global consumption, by the way. No, global consumption, not American consumption. Okay, so we pretty much write off sheep and goats. Right, from now. So we've noticed poultry going up and beef kind of staying the same or going down a little bit. Well, who eats beef in the world, mostly? What countries? The rich countries. United States, Western European countries, Japan, now China. Right? China is increasingly a beef consumer. And if you look at sort of the ways people consume different ag products, when a country gets up to a certain level of industrial development, in other words, once it gets to a certain level of wealth, they start eating beef. Okay? So beef production kind of increases. Now, beef production has slid, it's sort of slided down in the last few decades. And in the United States, that's something that people have shifted away from eating a lot of beef like they used to. When I was growing up, it was like, you had beef or pork on the table every night. And now, I never eat beef hardly, ever. I mean, last time I made burgers a couple weeks ago for other people, and I ate one or two. But beef generally is not something I consume all the time. I don't really like chicken, but everybody loves chicken apparently. So chicken has gone way, 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 way up. And chicken is one of those forms of protein, meat protein, or animal protein, that is among the cheapest forms to produce. Okay? Beef is not. Beef takes a lot of inputs per calorie. Pork is actually a lot cheaper than beef. I don't know why we don't have pork on here. Oh, we do have pork on here, but you can't see it. And I can't see it here. I don't know what happened to it. It's so weird. Okay, so I think pork must have taken off too. You can see it where it crosses these lines. All right. So what's missing? Beef, sheep and goats, pork and poultry. What's missing? Fish, yeah. And marine products, basically fish, consumption, seafood products, whatever you want to call it, has gone way up in recent decades, and really throughout since the 1980s, really. 1980s. So a lot of people have shifted their diets to include a lot more fish. Transportation changes or changes in the speed of transportation and the cost of transportation has gone way down. The speed of transportation has gone way up, so that now fresh seafood is available where it never was 20, 30 years ago. And also it's cheaper now because of aquaculture, okay? Fish farming. Is fish farming a big business in the United States? What do we produce? We produce catfish, we produce maybe some crawfish in South Louisiana, Arkansas. But as far as aquaculture and producing, we also have some salmon, farms. But mainly the United States is like in the dark ages when it comes to aquaculture and producing fish compared to China and Southeast Asia. But we'll talk about that when we get into marine resources. We're not really there yet. Gosh, this is horrible. Okay, so the pesticide use in the United States. All I really want to say here is that you can notice that, okay, this is insecticides. So by pesticide, we mean herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, rodenticides, but mostly we're talking about herbicides and insecticides, okay? Insecticide use and herbicide use are, I don't know what other would be, but let's see, herbicides are right here. I don't know if you can see this, and this is just some gross measure of the amount that we use in the United States between, and this says in the United States 1987 and 2012. Look at that. Okay, 87. Okay, that works. So let's look at this line. Herbicides pretty much stayed the same until the last 10 years or so, or the last 20 years or so, and they've creeped upward. We don't have data past this, but you can bet that the herbicide production has gone up in recent years. Now, insecticide use has gone down generally. It's been pretty stable, but it has gone down, and that's a good thing. Why is using fewer insecticides a good thing? That's just an easy question.
It's really bad for the environment because it affects a lot of groups that you're not targeting necessarily.
It kills everything, right?
Yeah.
Every insect, right? So it's not. I don't know of any insecticide that's specific to a certain type of pest, insect pest, or doesn't have to be an insect necessarily, but what do you call them? Ticks. Anyway, so that's not good. So have we had any issues with losing certain insects in recent years? If you lose your pollinators, if you lose honeybees, we're in a big problem. We have a big problem. Honeybees have had all sorts of problems in recent decades, but more and more herbicides or more and more insecticides have killed them off. Honeybees seem to be coming back a little bit. I've seen a couple swarms this last year, in fact. Now, why have herbicides tended to go up recently? Couple answers there. Number one, we have an increase in a good thing for the soil. We have an increase in no-till agriculture recently. Last 20 years, no-till agriculture has really expanded. If you drive around rural Payne County, you'll see plenty of examples of no-till farming, no-till agriculture. But there is a trade-off. And that trade-off is, even though you may be conserving soil and conserving moisture in soil, you still have to make a profit. You have to get rid of weeds. And the use of herbicides allows that. Now, certain types of crops don't have to be weeded, but they certain types of crops require some degree of weeding. So increases in no-till farming require more inputs, in general, more inputs of herbicide use. Okay, that makes sense. Now, how are you able to grow a crop and spray Roundup on it and still allow the crop to survive? You know what Roundup is? Roundup is a brand name for, what's the actual name of it? It's a type of salt. Anyway, it's not on mine at the moment, but this is a chemical that kills plants. Okay, pretty much everything except grass. Okay, well, it will kill grass too. I'm sorry, it will kill grass. But you know, most homeowners use it to spray weeds in their driveway. Roundup is, however, is a commercial scale, agricultural herbicide that was developed by Monsanto Corporation. And what it did was it allowed farmers to really control weeds, control weed growth on many different crops. There are also crops now that are genetically modified so that they are resistant to Roundup. Okay, so Roundup Ready, so-called Roundup Ready crops, you can spray them with Roundup and everything dies but the crop, which is amazing, right? So now, killing off all the honeybees is not good. Producing genetically modified organisms and growing genetically modified organisms is controversial. Right? Some people are adamantly in favor of genetically modified crops, genetically modified organisms in general. Others, especially on the environmental side of the spectrum, are very much against it. So here's a slide on the increasing use of genetically modified crops. By the way, the United States is the greatest user of genetically modified crops. We produce three main crops are the GM, often Roundup Ready forms of crops: soybeans, cotton, and corn. All of which need to be weeded. So GM, genetically modified versions of this that are not susceptible to the herbicide have expanded greatly. The United States, as you will have read perhaps, the United States produces about twice as much GM crops as Brazil, and Brazil is the second largest user of GM crops. Where are GM crops? This is not General Motors. Genetically modified GMO, or genetically modified crops. Where are those really not welcome? What countries? Anybody know? The European Union has very, very strict restrictions against not just the use of genetically modified crops, which they don't allow, but even the importation of commodities that are GM commodities. Yeah.
So from like I forgot what it was. It's like the yellow wild like mustard plant. It was genetically modified to get like cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, broccoli. So do they not like eat any of that?
They don't do that. Yeah. As far as I know. Now, of course, Norman Borlaug, you've heard of him, I suppose. He's the one that came up with golden rice. So this was one of the things that saved some of the poorest countries in the world from huge famines, because it was an easily grown carbohydrate. So yeah, they don't import that, I don't believe. I don't think it's allowed, at least. So what's their argument? What are the arguments against genetically modified crops or organisms in general? What do people fear? Frankenstein crops, some people call them.
Has there been any like substantial evidence to show that genetically modified crops have like possible human health hazards?
Well, I don't know of any examples, but that's what most of the pro-GM folks will say, that these have been vetted by laboratories over and over, and as far as anybody can tell, there's no risk to it, okay? However, how much faith do you want to put in the government, right? So that's one issue. Okay, genetically modified organisms might produce something, a chemical or whatever, that humans would ingest that might affect them in some way. You know, there are people who, and even in your textbook, there are statements that connect the use of pesticides with increases in autism and ADHD in the United States. Okay, so I'm never going to say if there's a connection there. I don't know, but there are people who believe there could be. All right, and maybe there's some scientific evidence to it. I don't know. So that's a genetically modified organism with it's different somehow from regular old natural selection. So who knows what it could be doing to your body? All right, so that's one argument. There are other arguments, though. More environmental arguments. So what are those?
It's like bad for the environment to grow like genetically modified crops because it can have like effects on like the soil or like other animals eating it and like it can affect them.
Yeah. The BT crops, the crops that are modified to resist, like BT corn. BT is a soil bacterium, and there is a chemical that it produces, and so the BT crops have been genetically modified to have what that bacteria produces that basically is a pesticide. And so, grasshopper eats a piece of BT corn, it drops to the ground dead. All it did was try to eat a little piece of corn, right? Or leaf or whatever. So with that, and it's been shown that chemical actually does build up in the soil, which you would kind of assume because if you plow under the crop, it's going to be there, right? So it's adding to it's adding new things to the soil that might make it sterile to all pests, all insects or worms or whatever. So that's not good. There are other reasons why. So it's sort of like the environmental side of the argument about chemicals, residual chemicals. What's another one? Think about invasive species. Okay, what if you have a genetically modified crop that can reproduce in the environment on its own, but it's resistant to any form of pesticide? So it could actually take over and spread and be impossible to get rid of. So it could affect food chain or whatever. It could become part of the environment accidentally, right? Like the Bradford pear. Okay, Bradford pear examples, or any number of other domesticated crops that have gone feral. Okay, so and there are other arguments against genetically modified crops. From a sort of a economic and social standpoint. But good, you guys are thinking. Now, this is a discussion about cereal productions, and well, I'm going to leave it at this because this graph's kind of messed up too. Here is the percentage of those crops that are grown today, or at least this is just the United States, I think. But look at how corn, soybeans, and cotton since 1995 have pretty much all wound up being genetically modified in some way. So now there's some wheat too. And anyway, those are, it's a standard thing now. So to have your seeds being patented, right? So patented production of patented crops. Now, all right. Okay, so there's our reading assignment again, and we've just kind of discussed some of the material so far in this reading assignment. Let's go ahead and jump into some definitions of some things you'll run into. And this is mostly associated with cropland conservation, okay? So I'll refer sometimes to intensive agriculture and extensive agriculture. Your textbook uses a slightly different take on it, but it's kind of the same thing. Extensive agriculture is basically requires a lot of land to produce not so much of a return. So low production per unit area, relatively low capital input, labor input, and it produces generally bulky, low-value commodities. Okay, not all of those. Cattle ranching, for example, could be in some ways considered extensive agriculture. Most of the cattle operations in Oklahoma, right? And probably all have maybe parents or grandparents that have rural land and may run some beef cattle on that land. Most of the time, those are what are called cow-calf operations, and they're essentially breeding calves. Okay, so they're breeding heifers and producing calves, and then selling the calves as maybe yearlings. Okay? And those will often go into another type of operation where they gain weight on grass, and then when it's time, when they max out their weight, then they're taken to a feedlot, and they're finished by staying on the feedlot for a number of months and putting on lots and lots of fat, and then they go off to slaughter. So, but mostly, most of the time, a cow-calf operation is just basically keeping heifers around and cows so that they produce calves. Extensive agriculture would also include, it would include nomadic herding or pastoralism. It might include wheat farming, perhaps. Okay, it's relatively low value per land area, per acre, or whatever you want to call it, hectare. Intensive agriculture is only understood in relation to extensive agriculture. So a more intensive form of agriculture just generally requires higher labor and capital input. You're going to get a higher production per unit area, and typically it'll produce very high value crops. So we mentioned organic agriculture earlier. Organic agriculture, as a rule, is always a more intensive form of agriculture than extensive agriculture. It takes fewer, you're producing a crop with a greater amount of loss to insects, pests, and also because it's not genetically modified, it may spoil faster. So you're going to have a lower return overall on the amount of crops. It may take you longer to produce it. It may take a lot more labor, okay? But overall, the value is going to be a little bit higher. I just started doing something recently that is, I think it's, I can't believe I started doing this. Like one of my main sources, personally, my main sources of protein are eggs, okay? I eat a lot of eggs. And eggs are a cheap form of protein, generally, okay? They're actually egg production is actually a not so efficient form of protein production. It takes a lot of feed, a lot of water to produce so much protein compared to like milk production or beef or chicken or something like that. Dairy production is actually pretty efficient, and I drink a lot of milk too. But something I've started doing is buying free range eggs. Have y'all ever used those? You like them? Any better? When I was a kid growing up, we had chickens, okay, and I used to go feed the chickens every morning, every evening, clean out the chicken house. I hated that, but we had chickens, and we always had way more eggs than we ever needed. So we gave them away to our friends and neighbors and stuff. But we also ate a lot of eggs growing up, and I remember, whenever any of y'all ever got to gather eggs? Like, okay, you have. So you know about like double yolkers and stuff like that, right? So those are cool. Sometimes you get really big ones, sometimes little tiny ones. Sometimes you get double yolkers, but our chickens were always. We fed them, of course, but we always let them roam around. And in the pasture, and so they were eating grasshoppers and ticks, I guess, and everything else. And I grew up eating eggs with yolks that were nearly orange, and then over time, as I became more civilized, I guess, living in town and all that stuff, I got used to Walmart, and Walmart's got these really cheap eggs. A dozen eggs is less than 75 cents or something like that. But the quality of the egg is terrible. It's like anemic looking, right? So I started buying organic eggs because I don't have chickens anymore, and I pay a lot more for them though. So I'm paying like 4 or 5 times the price of the cheap eggs next to them on the shelf. But I'm thinking, okay, the chickens that laid these were a lot happier than the ones that laid the ones in the green package, Walmart. They're not boxed up and they never touch the ground. These are chickens living a chicken's life, which to me makes a lot more sense and makes me feel better. So anyway, I started doing that. I don't know why I told you that. But maybe that's what when people start eating organic foods, not only do they feel better emotionally, or perhaps they feel like maybe they're doing the right thing morally or ethically, but the quality of the food is often better, right? And I found this with organic produce also, that it tastes better. It doesn't last as long, but it tastes better. It has often far more flavor. Okay, so intensive and extensive agriculture, and there's not really much point in talking about subsistence commercial agriculture, because commercial agriculture is the rule for us in this world.